There are moments in life when we stand in front of a wall that looks too high to climb, a problem that looks too big to solve, a situation that feels too broken to fix. In those moments, the enemy whispers a lie into your mind. It's impossible. But what the world calls impossible is often the very place where God chooses to display his power. You see, God specializes in situations where human strength runs out. When your resources are gone, when your plans fail, when your strength is exhausted, that is when heaven begins to move. Because God never intended for you to live by your ability alone. He designed your life so that his power would show up where your power ends. Think about the moments in life when everything seems closed, doors shut, opportunities disappear, hope fades. From a human perspective, it looks like the end. But from God's perspective, it is often just the beginning of a miracle, because God does not operate under human limitations. What restricts us does not restrict him. What confuses us does not confuse him. What overwhelms us does not overwhelm him. Too many people give up right before the miracle. They walk away from the very place where God is preparing to show his power. They stop believing because they are measuring their situation by what they can see instead of by who God is. But faith means believing that God is working even when you cannot see the evidence yet. God has a history of doing the impossible. When people thought there was no way forward, he made a way. When the future looked dead, he brought life. When circumstances said never, God said, watch what I can do. But here's the key. The impossible becomes possible when we trust God's authority over our situation. Faith is not ignoring reality. Faith is believing that God has the final word over reality. Your problem may be real. Your problem may be real. Your problem may be real. Your fear may be real. But God's power is greater than all of it. Sometimes God allows us to reach the edge of our abilities so that we stop depending on ourselves and start depending fully on him. Because as long as we believe we can fix everything ourselves, we rarely invite God to intervene. But when we surrender and say, Lord, this is beyond me, we open the door for divine intervention. And when God moves, he does not just fix the problem, he proves his power. He strengthens your faith. He reminds you that your life is not controlled by circumstances, but by the one who rules over them. So if you are facing something today that feels impossible, do not lose hope. Do not quit. Do not give. Do not give up on what God can do. Because the same God who turns darkness into light, who turns defeat into victory, and who turns hopeless situations into testimonies is still at work today. What looks impossible to you is simply an opportunity for God to reveal his greatness. And when he does, the story will not end with your struggle. It will end with his glory. It will end with his glory. When people look at a difficult situation, the first thing they usually measure is their own ability. They ask themselves questions like, do I have the strength to handle this? Do I have the resources to solve this? Do I have the connections to fix this problem? And when the answer to those questions is no, the conclusion often becomes very simple. This is impossible. Human logic is built on limitation. We evaluate everything based on what we can see, what we know, and what we can control, but God does not operate inside those boundaries. The God does not operate inside those boundaries. What seems impossible to us is never impossible for God, because his power is not restricted by the limits that define human life. He's not confined by time, by resources, by circumstances, or by the opinions of people. While we see obstacles, God sees opportunities. While we see closed doors, God sees a path that has not yet been revealed. The difference between our perspective and God's perspective is the difference between limitation and sovereignty. Often people assume that if something looks impossible, it must mean that it cannot happen. But the truth is that impossible situations are often the very places where God chooses to demonstrate his power most clearly. When everything appears easy, people tend to take the credit themselves. When the solution seems obvious, they rely on their own wisdom and strength. But when a situation becomes impossible by human standards, then the only explanation for a breakthrough is the power of God. That is why God frequently allows people to face circumstances that stretch their faith, not to defeat them, but to show them that his ability is far greater than their limitations. When you reach the point where your own plans cannot fix the problem, you are standing at the place where God's power can begin to work in ways you never imagined. Human beings naturally rely on what they understand. Human beings naturally rely on what they understand. They trust their education, their experience, and their strategies. These things are not wrong, but they can easily become the foundation of a person's confidence. When that foundation begins to crack, fear quickly enters the heart. Suddenly the future looks uncertain. Doubt begins to whisper that nothing will change. But this is exactly where faith changes the perspective. Faith shifts the focus away from human strength and places it on God's authority. Instead of asking, what can I do? Faith begins to ask, what can God do? And that question changes everything, because when you bring God into the center of the situation, the possibilities expand far beyond human understanding. God has never been limited by the conditions that limit people. Economic struggles do not limit him. Medical reports do not limit him. Broken relationships do not limit him. Delayed dreams do not limit him. What appears final to people is often just a temporary chapter in the story God is writing. Sometimes the greatest obstacle is not the problem itself, but the mindset that surrounds it. When people constantly tell themselves that something cannot happen, they begin to live as if it truly is impossible. Their expectations shrink. Their hope fades. Their vision becomes smaller. But God calls people to lift their eyes beyond what they currently see and trust that his power can create outcomes that human reasoning could never predict. This does not mean ignoring reality or pretending problems do not exist. It means recognizing that reality is not the highest authority. God is. Circumstances may describe the situation, but they do not control the final outcome when God chooses to intervene. History is filled with moments where the impossible suddenly became possible because God stepped into the situation. Lives that seemed broken were restored. Futures that seemed lost were rebuilt. Doors that looked permanently closed suddenly opened in ways no one expected. The reason these moments stand out so powerfully is because they remind people that God's power operates on a completely different level than human ability. When people begin to understand this truth, their perspective changes. Instead of being overwhelmed by the size of the problem, they become confident in the greatness of God. Instead of focusing on what cannot be done, they begin to trust in what God is capable of doing. And that shift in perspective creates room for faith to grow stronger. The impossible is not the end of the story when God is involved. It is often the starting point for something greater than anyone imagined. There comes a point in many people's lives when their strength simply is not enough anymore. They try to hold everything together. They push themselves harder. They search for answers, and they use every resource they have. But despite all their effort, the situation does not change. The pressure continues, the problem remains, and the weight becomes heavier than they can carry alone. It is in these moments that a powerful spiritual truth begins to reveal itself. Faith often begins where human strength ends. Human nature teaches us to rely on our own ability. From a young age, we are taught that success comes through hard work, determination, and personal skill. Those things matter, but they also create a mindset where people believe they must control everything themselves. They begin to think that if they just try harder, plan better, work longer, they can solve every challenge they face. For a while, that belief may seem to work, but eventually life presents a situation that cannot be solved by effort alone. Sometimes it comes through a crisis that no amount of planning could prevent. Sometimes it appears in a loss that cannot be reversed. Sometimes it comes through a door that remains closed no matter how many times a person tries to open it. When these moments happen, people often feel helpless because they have reached the limit of what they can do. Yet that moment of weakness is not always a defeat. In many cases, It is actually the doorway to a deeper relationship with God. When human strength runs out, people finally recognize that they were never meant to carry every burden by themselves. They begin to understand that their dependence on God is not a sign of failure, but a path. Work of how life was designed to work. Faith grows strongest when people stop relying only on their own power and start trusting in God's power. As long as everything seems manageable, many people keep God at a distance. They pray occasionally. They think about faith when it is convenient, but their confidence remains mostly in themselves. However, when life reaches a point where personal ability is no longer enough, the heart becomes open in a new way. That is often when people begin to pray with sincerity. They begin to seek God not just for guidance, but for help that only He can provide. Their prayers are no longer casual words spoken out of routine. They become honest conversations filled with dependence and trust. In that place, faith becomes real. Faith is not simply believing that God exists. Faith is trusting that He can do what we cannot do. It is the confidence that even when we have reached the end of our strength, God has not reached the end of His power. Where human ability stops, divine ability continues. This shift in perspective changes how people face their challenges. Instead of feeling defeated by the limits of their strength, they begin to see those limits as an invitation for God to move. Instead of believing the situation is hopeless, they begin to believe that something greater can still happen. Their circumstances may not immediately change, but their outlook begins to transform. In fact, some of the most powerful moments of spiritual growth happen when people realize that they cannot solve their problems on their own. It humbles the heart. It removes the illusion of control. It reminds them that life is not sustained by human strength alone, but by the power and grace of God. This does not mean that effort and responsibility disappear. People still work, plan, and make wise decisions, but their confidence shifts from self-reliance to God-reliance. They continue to do what they can while trusting God to do what they cannot. Over time, this kind of faith creates a deeper peace. Instead of constantly feeling the pressure to control every outcome, people learn to trust that God is working even in situations they do not fully understand. They realize that their limitations do not stop God's plans. In fact, those limitations often become the very place where His power becomes most visible. When human strength ends, the story is not over. That moment can become the beginning of something far greater. A life that is no longer driven by fear of weakness, but strengthened by trust in the limitless power of God. Many people walk away from their breakthrough without even realizing it. They stop believing, stop trying, and stop hoping at the very moment when things are closest to changing. Life becomes heavy, the waiting becomes long, and disappointment begins to build. After enough setbacks, it becomes easy to believe that nothing will ever improve. When that belief takes root, people often quit, not because the miracle is impossible, but because the struggle has lasted longer than they expected. One of the greatest challenges in life is not the problem itself, but the patience required to endure the process. Everyone loves the idea of victory, but few people are prepared for the waiting that often comes before it. When progress feels slow and answers seem delayed, doubt begins to creep into the mind. Questions start forming. Why hasn't anything changed? Did I misunderstand the promise? Is this situation ever going to turn around? Those questions can slowly drain hope from the heart. Yet the truth is that many breakthroughs happen after seasons of persistence. Growth often occurs beneath the surface long before it becomes visible. Just because change cannot be seen immediately does not mean that nothing is happening. There are moments when circumstances appear completely still, but unseen progress is taking place behind the scenes.
In difficult seasons, people tend to measure progress only by visible results. If they cannot see improvement, they assume nothing is moving forward.
But life does not always operate on a schedule that matches human expectations. Sometimes preparation must take place before the outcome appears. Sometimes strength must be developed before the door opens. Sometimes character must grow before the opportunity arrives. When people give up too early, they interrupt the very process that could have led them to their breakthrough. They allow temporary discouragement to determine a permanent decision. Instead of continuing forward, they step back and accept defeat, even though the story was never meant to end there. Discouragement has a powerful voice. It tells people that their efforts are wasted. It convinces them that their faith has been misplaced. It whispers that things will always stay the same. Over time, those negative thoughts can feel convincing because they repeat themselves again, but those thoughts do not represent the truth about what God is capable of doing. Faith requires endurance. It asks people to keep believing even when the results are not immediate. It invites them to trust that God's timing is often different from their own expectations. Just because the answer has not arrived yet does not mean it will never arrive. History and experience both show that some of the most powerful moments in life happen after people refuse to quit. Breakthroughs often come after long periods of perseverance. Success often appears after repeated attempts. The difference between those who experience transformation and those who miss it is often the willingness to keep going one step longer than they felt capable of taking. It is important to remember that God's work in a person's life does not always follow a straight line. There may be moments of progress followed by seasons that feel slow or uncertain. But even during those quiet seasons, God can still be shaping circumstances in ways that cannot yet be seen. Sometimes the delay itself carries purpose. Waiting can strengthen faith, deepen patience, and build resilience in the heart. These qualities prepare people not only to receive their breakthrough, but also to handle it wisely when it arrives. When individuals continue to trust despite the difficulty, they position themselves to experience the moment when everything changes. What once looked impossible begins to shift. Doors that seem permanently closed begin to open. Opportunities appear where none seemed to exist before. And when that happens, the long season of perseverance suddenly makes sense. The greatest tragedy is not that life contains difficult seasons. The greatest tragedy is when someone walks away right before the turning point. Quitting too early can cause a person to miss the very outcome they were hoping for. Persistence does not mean ignoring pain or pretending challenges are easy. It simply means refusing to surrender hope. It means choosing to believe that the story is not finished yet. When people hold on to faith through the struggle, they keep the door open for the moment when the impossible begins to change. Life often presents situations that feel overwhelming. There are moments when circumstances appear so powerful that they seem to control everything around us. A difficult diagnosis, financial pressure, broken relationships, or unexpected loss can make people feel as though their future is being decided by forces beyond their control. When these situations arise, it becomes easy to believe that circumstances have the final say. Fear grows. Uncertainty spreads, and hope begins to weaken. But faith calls people to see their situation through a different lens. Faith reminds us that while circumstances may be real, they are not the highest authority. God is. Trusting God's authority means recognizing that no problem, no challenge, and no obstacle stands above his power. It means understanding that even when life feels chaotic, God is still sovereign over every detail. Circumstances may look strong, but they are never stronger than the one who created the world. Problems may appear permanent, but they are not beyond the reach of God's intervention. One of the greatest struggles people face is allowing what they see to determine what they believe. Human vision is limited. We can only see the present moment and the conditions surrounding us. When everything around us looks negative, it becomes difficult to imagine a different outcome. But faith is not built on what is visible. Faith is built on the character and authority of God. Trust begins when a person chooses to believe that God's word and promises carry more weight than the situation in front of them. This does not mean denying reality or pretending that problems do not exist. It means refusing to allow those problems to define the future. Instead of letting fear lead the way, trust invites God to take the central place in the situation. When people rely only on their understanding, they often feel trapped by what they cannot control. Their thoughts begin to circle around the same questions. What if things never change? What if the situation gets worse? What if there is no solution? Those questions can create a cycle of anxiety that slowly drains hope and confidence. But trusting God's authority breaks that cycle. It shifts the focus away from the uncertainty of circumstances and places it on the certainty of God's power. God's authority means that nothing happens outside. His awareness and nothing is beyond his ability to transform. Even situations that appear completely hopeless can change when he moves. What seems impossible to human reasoning can become possible when God's power is involved. Trusting him means believing that he is able to work in ways we cannot predict and through paths we may not yet understand. There are times when the process may take longer than expected. Waiting can be one of the most difficult parts of faith because people naturally want quick answers and immediate solutions. When those answers do not come right away, doubt may begin to grow. Yet trusting God's authority means believing that his timing is also part of his wisdom. Just because something has not happened yet does not mean it will never happen. Trust grows stronger when people learn to surrender control. That surrender does not mean giving up responsibility or effort. Instead, it means releasing the burden of trying to control every outcome. It means doing what is right, making wise decisions, and then placing the final result in God's hands. When that shift occurs, the heart begins to experience a deeper sense of peace. Instead of living under constant pressure, people begin to walk with confidence that God is guiding their steps. They understand that circumstances may change, but God's authority remains constant. Storms may come, challenges may appear, but those things do not have the final voice over their lives. Over time, this trust transforms how people respond to adversity. Rather than being overwhelmed by fear, they begin to stand with quiet confidence. Rather than being defined by their problems, they become strengthened through them. Their perspective changes because they know that no matter how powerful a situation may appear, it is never greater than the authority of God. This understanding creates stability in uncertain times. When people truly trust God's authority over their situation, they are no longer controlled by what they see. Instead, they are guided by the assurance that God is still in control and his power is able to bring change in ways no one could have imagined. Life has a way of placing people in situations they never expected to face. Moments arrive that feel confusing, painful, or overwhelming. Dreams collapse, doors close, and circumstances unfold in ways that seem unfair or impossible to understand. In those moments, it is easy to believe that the struggle itself is the final chapter of the story. The pain feels permanent, and the situation appears too broken to ever produce anything good. Yet time and again, people discover that the very situations that once caused them the most distress later become the stories that reveal the greatest evidence of God's faithfulness. What begins as a problem can eventually become a testimony. A testimony is more than just a story about survival. It is a story about transformation. It shows how something that once looked impossible eventually changed in a way that only God could have orchestrated. The circumstances may have started with confusion, fear, or uncertainty, but the ending reveals purpose, strength, and faith that grew through the process. During difficult seasons, however, it can be very hard to imagine that any good will come from the experience. When people are in the middle of pain, their focus is naturally on the immediate struggle. They wonder why the situation is happening and how long it will last. They may feel isolated, believing that no one else truly understands what they are going through. But what they cannot yet see is that God is often working beneath the surface, shaping something meaningful out of what appears to be chaos. God has a way of turning struggles into stories that encourage others. When someone walks through an impossible situation and eventually sees a breakthrough, their experience becomes powerful evidence that faith is not empty. Their journey becomes a reminder that hope is still alive even when circumstances look hopeless. A testimony carries influence because it proves that transformation is possible. Many of the stories that inspire people the most began in places of deep difficulty. They began with someone who felt overwhelmed, uncertain, and unsure of how things would turn out. At the time, the struggle felt unbearable. But through patience, faith, and the unseen work of God, the situation eventually shifted. What once looked like defeat became a powerful example of resilience and divine intervention. One of the remarkable aspects of a testimony is that it does not erase the struggle that came before it. Instead, it gives meaning to the struggle. The challenges that once felt pointless begin to reveal purpose. The pain that once seemed unbearable becomes part of a story that strengthens both the individual and the people who hear about it. This transformation also changes how people view future challenges. When someone has seen God move in one impossible situation, their faith becomes stronger when another challenge appears. They remember that the same God who helped them before is still capable of working again. Their confidence grows because they have experienced firsthand that circumstances do not always remain the way they initially appear. Testimonies also create connection between people. When someone shares the story of how they moved from struggle to breakthrough, others who are facing similar challenges find encouragement. They begin to believe that if change was possible for one person, it may also be possible for them. In this way, one person's testimony can become a source of hope for many others. It is important to remember that testimonies are rarely created overnight. The process often includes moments of waiting, learning, and growing. Faith deepens through those experiences, and character develops in ways that would not have happened without the challenge. When the breakthrough finally arrives, it carries more meaning because of the journey that came before it. The story that once began with fear eventually becomes a story filled with gratitude. The same situation that once caused sleepless nights and unanswered questions later becomes the reason someone can stand with confidence and say that God was faithful through it all. In that moment, the impossible situation is no longer remembered only as a problem. It becomes a testimony that reveals the power, guidance, and faithfulness of God in a way that others can see and believe. One of the most challenging parts of faith is learning to trust God's timing. People often want answers immediately. When a problem appears, the natural instinct is to look for a quick solution. When a prayer is spoken, the expectation is that the response should arrive right away. But life does not always unfold at the speed we desire. Sometimes days turn into months, and months turn into years before the outcome becomes clear. During that waiting period, it can feel as though nothing is happening. Doubt may quietly enter the mind, and questions begin to surface about whether things will ever change. Yet waiting does not mean that God is inactive. What feels like silence from our perspective is often a period of preparation from His perspective. While people focus on the visible results, God is often working behind the scenes, arranging circumstances, shaping character, and preparing the right moment for something greater to unfold. His timing is not random or careless. It is purposeful and precise, even when it does not match human expectations. Human timid. People see a need and want it resolved quickly. They see an opportunity and want it resolved quickly. They see an opportunity and want it to happen immediately. But God sees the entire picture, including the parts that are hidden from human understanding. He knows what needs to happen before the breakthrough can arrive. Sometimes certain lessons must be learned. Sometimes certain people must enter the story. Sometimes certain doors must close before the right door opens. If every prayer were answered instantly, people might never develop the patience and trust that strengthen their faith. Waiting stretches the heart in ways that immediate answers cannot. It teaches endurance. It teaches humility. It teaches the ability to rely on God even when the outcome is not yet visible. During seasons of waiting, the temptation to lose hope can become strong. People may begin to think that their prayers were unheard or that their hopes were unrealistic. But often the delay is not a rejection. It is simply a reminder that God's plans operate on a timeline that is greater than human schedules. There are moments when a delayed answer eventually reveals why the waiting was necessary. What seemed like an unanswered prayer at one time later becomes clear as protection or preparation. Sometimes the door that did not open would have led to disappointment or harm. Sometimes the opportunity that did not arrive earlier would not have been sustainable without the growth that occurred during the waiting period. Trusting God's timing requires a shift in perspective. Instead of constantly focusing on how long something is taking, faith invites people to focus on what God might be doing during that time. Every season carries the potential for growth, even if the outcome is not immediately visible.
Waiting can also deepen a person's relationship with God when people are forced to slow down and rely on Him rather
than rushing toward their own solutions. They often begin to listen more carefully and pray more sincerely. Their faith becomes less about convenience and more about genuine trust. This process shakes the heart in important ways. Patience becomes stronger. Gratitude grows deeper. Dependence on God becomes more real. These qualities prepare people not only to receive the blessing they are waiting for, but also to handle it with wisdom and maturity when it finally arrives. Eventually, the moment often comes when what once seemed delayed suddenly becomes clear. The door opens, the situation changes, the opportunity appears. When that moment arrives, people sometimes realize that if the answer had come earlier, it would not have been as meaningful or as perfectly timed as it is now. The waiting season then takes on a new meaning. What once felt like frustration becomes a reminder of God's careful guidance. What once felt like uncertainty becomes evidence that His plans were unfolding all along, even when they could not yet be seen. Faith is not a one-time decision. It is a daily choice to trust in what cannot always be seen. Life constantly challenges people to make that choice, especially when circumstances appear overwhelming or outcomes seem uncertain. There are moments when human reasoning screams that something cannot happen, when the natural mind sees no solution, and when every possible option appears exhausted. In these moments, many people feel discouraged, tempted to give up, or convinced that hope is lost. Yet these are the exact moments when faith becomes most critical, because it is faith that bridges the gap between human limitation and God's limitation. Believing that God can act on your behalf, even when there is no visible evidence of change, requires a mindset that is anchored in trust rather than in sight. Humans naturally rely on what they can see, measure, or control. But faith asks people to look beyond the immediate and trust in the character and promises of God. The invisible reality of God's power is always greater than the visible reality of a situation. Faith does not ignore the problem or deny its existence. Instead, it acknowledges the difficulty while affirming that God's ability exceeds the challenge. People often underestimate the challenge. People often underestimate the role of patience in faith. Many give up too soon because they are measuring the progress by immediate results. They expect quick solutions and instant resolution. When those do not come, discouragement begins to erode hope. But faith teaches endurance. It encourages people to persevere even when the circumstances seem to mock their persistence. The longer a person continues to trust, the more they position themselves to witness the fullness of God's work. Sometimes the breakthrough comes not in the first attempt or after the first prayer, but after consistent, unwavering belief that God is able. Faith also requires humility. It asks people to acknowledge that they cannot solve every problem on their own. While effort, wisdom, and diligence are important, faith reminds people that their ability alone is insufficient. Recognizing human limitation is not a sign of weakness. It is an invitation to rely on God's strength. The same situations that overwhelm people often become the very stages where God demonstrates His power most clearly. When human effort reaches its end, divine intervention begins. Another essential aspect of faith is hope. Hope sustains belief during the waiting period. When everything seems stagnant and answers appear delayed, hope encourages persistence. It strengthens the heart to continue believing that God is working behind the scenes. Even when the situation seems static, Hope affirms that the story is not finished. God's timing is perfect, and delays are often periods of preparation, refinement, or protection. The invisible work happening in those moments prepares the way for the visible breakthrough. Faith.
You don't have to be mean. You don't have to stay close. As long as you're somewhere out there, that's enough for me. I don't need to hold you near me, don't need promises to keep. Just the thought that you are breathing somewhere in this world I see. Even if I'm not beside you, even if you never know, there's a quiet kind of comfort just in knowing you still glow. I don't need forever, I just need you to exist. You don't have to stay with me, you don't have to feel the same. Just as long as you're still out there, calling softly through my days. You don't have to look my way, you don't have to be my home. It's enough to know you're living in a world I'm not alone. I won't chase you through the distance, won't disturb your chosen life. I'll just keep you in my silence, like a star that shines at night. Through the dark and through the blue, I still think of you. You don't have to stay with me, you don't have to feel the same. Just as long as you're still out there, calling softly through my days. You don't have to look my way, you don't have to be my home. It's enough to know you're living in a world I'm not alone. I don't need to be your light, I don't need to cross your mind. All I need is just the truth that you're somewhere still alive. You don't have to stay with me, you don't have to feel the same. Just as long as you're still out there, calling softly through my days. You don't have to look my way, you don't have to be my home. It's enough to know you're